Welcome back. Popular films such as the XMen series will be used by researchers to explore how they can help families engage with new developments in genetics. The Wellcome Genome Campus has come up with the idea as more and more families come into contact with the issue of genetic research through treatments and screening. In 2012, the Wellcome Trust Monitor report found that only 12% of people said they knew what the human genome actually was. Well, with me now is Jonathan Roberts, genetic counsellor and researcher at the Wellcome Genome Campus and King's College London. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
So first of all, tell us why the study. Why is it so important that you do this study and engage the public?
So genetics is really starting to come into its own, and it's going to be something that families come into contact with a lot more. So they will be coming into contact with it in hospitals as genetic testing becomes more common, but also as consumers in terms of, things like buying GM food. It's just going to be a subject that people will really need to know a lot more about in the upcoming years.
Now, as we said before, there's quite a large proportion of people that don't know what the genome is, and just a third said that they understood the term genetic modification. So you're really up against it, aren't you?
So I think when it comes, there's some very specific terms like genetic modification and genomes, very technical scientific terms that people don't feel confident saying they understand, but they may have heard of. They may be familiar with it in a kind of loose sense, but don't feel confident enough to say, oh yes, I know what that is, or I could explain that to somebody else. So there's a lot of work to be done, especially with some of those sort of newer specific terms like genomic and genetic modification, and really kind of getting that into the popular consciousness and getting people feel confident to understand what that means.
So how can popular films like X-Men actually help?
So what I'm doing in my research is looking at ways of hooking onto people's interests. So things that people feel comfortable talking about and are interested in and will kind of chat about, as a family or, in a cafe or in the pub, and build on that as a form of public engagement. And one of the things that people are interested in is popular culture, so TV, books, films, and it's trying to use that as a way of getting people talking about genetics in a way that's not very threatening.
Now, you're really up against it, particularly because in some ways genetics has had very good press. On the other hand, in terms of the treatments that are coming through and ways of saving people from fatal illnesses they may have inherited, but also there's been a huge bad press because of GM foods. So tell us exactly what the picture is for people, researchers and scientists like yourself, in trying to get the positive message across.
So I think you're right, genetics can feel like a scary subject. So it can feel scary partly in terms of things like GM food. I think GM food has had some a tough time trying to get positive messages out there. And then there's the health messages. Health messages can be very positive because there's a huge amount that we can do with genetic testing that can really benefit families. The challenge with that is that it can then be a very scary subject for people. So sort of health-related stuff, genetics and health can be something that people feel is slightly frightening, slightly threatening, and therefore might not want to explore it. So there's part of the public engagement is about just getting information out there. So helping people understand what we mean by GM food, what we mean by genetic testing. And part of that is actually then making it less threatening. So kind of making those messages more easy to absorb and less kind of overtly sciencey, and perhaps a bit more kind of fun and a bit more interesting, and just something that you might want to read and be interested in, and just kind of make that more absorbable and easy for people.
And of course, Angelina Jolie made an announcement that she had the BRCA1 gene. What impact did that have on researchers and scientists in the field, in terms of public engagement?
So Angelina Jolie is a really good example of just raising awareness about genetics. So when she had genetic testing for BRCA1, she was very vocal about it. A lot of stories came in the press, and it was a really great piece of public engagement and just raising awareness of kind of what's possible in terms of genetic testing. I think one of the challenges is then helping people understand a bit more about it. So there's great in it's raising awareness. The next stage is then helping people have a more kind of nuanced understanding about what that genetic test involves, what would be the appropriate circumstances to have that genetic test. And that's, I think, kind of where the second level of public engagement comes in. So it's great to raise awareness, and that's a lot of what public engagement should be doing. And then once you've kind of raised awareness, it's then also really good to help people have a more kind of nuanced understanding of that kind of particular area.
So tell us about the survey, the study that you're doing at the moment. How far are you with that, and what are the parameters of it? What are you doing?
So my research is going to take 2 phases. And the first is a survey. So it's a very broad survey, just kind of looking at what people are interested in, kind of, what films they've watched, how familiar they are with sort of terms like genetics and genomics, and kind of a little bit about maybe the conversations that they might have as a family about kind of what's inherited in the family. So, for example, some families are convinced that stubbornness is a trait that's inherited in their family. So the survey is kind of broadly looking at that, and that's available now. And that's live and online. And then I'm also looking kind of a bit more in depth and doing some interviews with families, sitting down with families, having a very informal chat, and just sort of seeing how those conversations play out in real life.
So what's the ultimate goal? What you were hoping that the results of that study will inform? Will it be pamphlets? Will it be sort of when we hear news about genetic treatments or achievements, there'll be an easier to understand sort of code for people? How will it translate?
So I'm looking at sort of a couple of things. The first is this kind of awareness. So looking at ways of doing public engagement that raises awareness of genetics and genomics and gets it out there in a non-threatening way. So kind of builds on people's kind of own interest and understanding, and so things like maybe videos online or websites or kind of comic books or kind of just things that you can kind of do as a public engagement exercise. Coming from a genetic counselling background, I'm also interested in how this can benefit clinical work, so communication with patients. I think, picking up on Angelina Jolie, one of the challenges that quite a few of the clinical departments had was a sudden sort of surge in interest in people wanting more information about BRCA1, and it's providing not only reliable information but very accessible information to large amounts of people when there's a sudden increase in sort of interest in a particular topic, and you need to be able to kind of provide that information kind of quickly and easily.
In fact, access to genetics is now easier than most people realise. Tell us a bit about what the cost involved is of actually, finding out the structure of your own DNA.
So the speed and the cost at which you can do genetic screening is coming down all the time. So it used to take, I think, almost a year to have, BRCA1 and BRCA2 sequence, and now it can be done much quicker. And the great challenge that a lot of research is doing is for the $1,000 genome. So it's getting your genome sequence for under $1,000. They're not far away from that. The challenge then becomes interpretation. So you have this incredible proliferation of information. So genomes, very easy to sequence, you can get a lot of information, but then actually interpreting that information is a big challenge. The upshot for what will happen in clinic and when you go to the hospital is that you will start to see genetic testing become more and more common. So there's more things we can test for, it becomes more relevant, and it will also move from the specialist departments of clinical genetics, and you'll start seeing it in all other departments, like maybe cardiology or cancer, and it will just become a lot more common as a test.
But it won't become any simpler, effectively, because it's an incredible, complex piece of research that's going on. It must be really hard to communicate that to patients.
Yeah, so I think there's some tests you'll have in the hospital that will be very simple. There'll be some tests that are quite quick and easy, and you almost might not even notice that it's a genetic test. So an example might be a test to quickly see whether somebody, a particular drug in a particular situation is going to be suitable, and those can be quite simple. But then there are also huge amounts of more complex genetic tests, and those I think will still be dealt with by clinical genetics departments, because there's a huge challenge in explaining complex genetic information and making sure that families and individuals have that test at the right time that's right for them, and sometimes they may not want the test. So I think a lot of that communication will still be done in a clinical genetics department, taking plenty of time and going through that, because it's always a challenge communicating genetics. There's no right or wrong answer.
So if anyone out there wants to take part in the survey, is really keen, do they have to have a genetic sort of issue in the family or not?
Absolutely not. So it's open to everybody. So I'm interested in anybody for whatever interest. So there's absolutely no kind of restrictions. If you have knowledge about genetics or genetics in the family, absolutely you can take part. If you have barely heard of genomics or genetics, you just want to have a look, then also it'd be great to have them on board as well.
And how do they get in touch?
So there's a website called thecharacterofdna.com, and there's information about the study. There's a link to the survey, and it's all on there. There's also a few kind of little stories and blogs as well that kind of shows kind of what I'm trying to do. So there's some stuff on there, for example, about using Harry Potter as a way to get people talking about inheritance. So sort of things like that. So if you go to characterofdna.com, and you can find all about it there.